Finally, the long-awaited freedom. Cynthia looked around in bewilderment, sadly thinking that her best years had been spent behind that high fence. 3 long years in prison and for nothing. But nevertheless, it's necessary to move on. There is no other choice. I'll go look for Mrs. Faust's house, the girl decided, feeling for the money in her pocket. It should be enough for the journey. I'll manage for a while and then we'll see. Cynthia had inherited the house from a distant relative who didn't even know her, nor cared to. Because of this inheritance, when she was an orphan, the state didn't give her any housing, citing the fact that she had this tiny house of 5 by 7 meters in a remote village. Well, if this is my inheritance, then I'll be a homeowner, Cynthia bitterly reflected. Back then, after leaving the orphanage, she decided to stay in the city, hoping to find a good job and meet a beloved man. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. She was very young then and believed that she would definitely be lucky. Something good had to happen in her life. Cynthia naively believed that all the bad things were behind her. When she was a child, her mother and stepfather drank and mistreated her, sending her out into the cold or locking her up in the house for days and disappearing. Little Cynthia learned to survive by begging for food from neighbours. On the day her mother died, after another drinking spree, and her cold body was buried, her stepfather finally kicked her out of the house. It probably saved Cynthia's life, as no one knows what could have happened to her if she had been left alone with that despicable man. That's how she ended up in the orphanage, and although she was treated better here than in her own family, Cynthia never got used to the fact that her whole life was scheduled. She dreamed of becoming an adult, a free bird, and flying off into the clouds to find her happiness. At 16, she went to study accounting. She lived in a dormitory room with other girls and still didn't feel free. Everything was still communal. When can I be mistress of my own life? She thought, getting ready for classes under the noisy laughter of her late-night partying roommates. After graduating with honours, she was hired as an assistant to the chief accountant in a small but strong company. Her boss's name was Grace. She was a tall, slim brunette with a rather dominant character. From the first moment of their acquaintance, Cynthia understood that her life was not going to be easy. Her boss looked down on her, overloaded her with work, and scolded her for the slightest mistake. But that wasn't the main problem. Cynthia was not stupid and quickly realized that something was wrong with the company's financial documents. She decided to talk to Grace, hoping that the mistakes she found in the reports were due to carelessness. "Why are you interfering in something that's not your business? Did someone ask you to show initiative?" exclaimed the boss unexpectedly. "Sit quietly, orphan, and don't stick your neck out, or you'll quickly be fired." Cynthia became scared, and she began to consider quitting. Then, out of the blue, an inspection arrived at their office. She remembered the day perfectly when the police came for her. She looked bewilderedly at the people who were telling her about thefts in large amounts. She couldn't understand why they were talking to her, since she had recently started working at the company and hadn't signed any important documents. "Is this your signature?" the investigator asked the girl strictly, showing her some financial papers. Cynthia looked with surprise at the signature, which resembled her own. "Someone forged these documents. I'm not guilty of anything. It's some nonsense," swirled in Cynthia's head. I'm probably dreaming and will wake up soon. All of this will disappear. And the disappearance of millions from the company's accounts, the investigators, the police station, and these senseless accusations. But the terrible dream didn't dissipate. The court sentenced her to 3 years in prison. All dreams of a free life, family and happiness were shattered instantly. 3 years later, Cynthia stood outside the walls of the prison and looked at the big open world that never became her home. How can I live now? The girl thought. I don't know how everything is arranged here, how all these people succeed in life. What do I need to do to become my own person in such a big world? 3 years in prison changed her outlook on life. Cynthia no longer dreamed of a bright future. She clearly understood that the prison label placed on her had taken away almost all hope. She knew women who, not finding themselves in the world of ordinary people, repeatedly returned to prison to feel protected in the familiar environment of grey walls, closed off from the rest of the world. Everything was simple and clear here. Life went according to schedule. Everyone had a job and food every day. Yes, they didn't have freedom of choice, but they didn't feel like a fish thrown onto the shore, suffocating from the air of freedom, but not knowing how to use it. That's how Cynthia felt. No, I won't stay here. I'll just disappear here, she thought, looking at the bustling city. I'll be set up again because now everyone will know that I was in prison, and at any moment they'll dump all their problems on me. No, now I'm ready to go far away from human eyes, to that village, where that old abandoned house has been waiting for me for so many years. That's where my fate will be. Endless fields flickered outside the window, and Cynthia looked sadly at the flocks of birds flying into the distance. How peaceful it must be up there in the sky, she thought. You're flying, and your feathers are fluttering from the light streams of warm air. Lost in these thoughts, she didn't even notice how the bus pulled up to the semi-ruined structure that had once been apparently a bus stop. Hey, come out, we've arrived, the driver called out to Cynthia. Cynthia got off the bus and asked a passerby for directions before walking along the old buildings. Excuse me, can you tell me where Mrs. Faust's house is? She asked an old man sitting on a bench by the road. I'm her distant relative, and I've come from the city. The house here is mine by inheritance. The old man slowly scrutinized Cynthia, shaking his head before replying, Your house isn't far. Let's go, I'll show you. I just don't know if you'll be happy with your inheritance. Around the bend, there was a plot overgrown with weeds. Here's where Mrs. Faust had been living. She passed away a long time ago. She was a lonely woman with no relatives. The house stayed empty for a long time, and someone burned it down last year. Now it's completely useless. Cynthia looked and couldn't believe her eyes. The ruins were staring back at her from behind the bushes. What have I come to, she thought, and I came all the way here for this? What am I going to do now? Her last hope was gone. The house was completely unsuitable for living. Nothing was left of the doors, windows and roof, and all the wooden parts had burned down. Well, are you going to take ownership of the inheritance? The elderly man asked, and Cynthia sighed heavily. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all this. I have no one in the world. I grew up in an orphanage and they didn't give me a place to live. They said it was part of my inheritance. I came here because I had nowhere else to go. Well, everything can be fixed if you think about it, the elderly man said. If you'd like, you can stay with me for a while. No one will have time to fix the house before winter, but in the spring we can figure out what to do." "But I have nothing, and only enough money for a short while," Cynthia said. "Are you completely helpless?" the man said. "We'll find you a job. Let's go to mine, get to know each other. I'll treat you to some tea, at least," he suggested, and Cynthia couldn't hold back her tears. "What's wrong?" The elderly man was a little taken aback. "Everything will slowly get better. What's your name?" "Cynthia," she replied through her sobs. "And I'm Mr. MacPhail. So don't mind me being old. I'm still strong. I'm a carpenter, and I'll help you fix up your house. And now let's go get warm. I live nearby." Cynthia settled in with Mr. MacPhail and confided in him that she had been released from prison recently. To her surprise, the old man calmly accepted the news, saying, "Well, anything can happen. I don't know if you were guilty or not, but I suspect not. And even if you were, there's nothing to steal from me. The only thing I have left is my old age. But I doubt it's of any interest to anyone." The village was 50 kilometers from Cynthia's hometown, which had ruined her fate. She desperately needed a job, but in the village there were only old people and no way to earn a living. In the city, she faced the thing she feared most. No one wanted to hire her. Her previous profession as an accountant was no longer an option after 3 years in prison for theft and embezzlement. Mr. MacPhail did not sit idly by. He called and begged old acquaintances who had left the village and settled in the city for help, but he received the same response everywhere. "Why do we need a convict?" Cynthia felt like a leper, but after agonizing searches, she finally found a job as a street cleaner. The job was very difficult, and at the end of the workday she literally collapsed from exhaustion. To get to the city before dawn and clear the streets before people went to work, she used to walk in the dark for 5 kilometers to the neighboring village, next to which the railway passed. Once there, Cynthia got on the train, which was empty except for homeless people who rode at night to keep warm. Looking at them, she thought that at any moment she could end up in their place, which was so scary that she tried not to think about what would happen if she ended up on the street without a warm corner again. One morning in early February, Cynthia couldn't get out of bed. She had caught the flu, which had taken all her strength and confined her to bed. Following it came a severe pneumonia, which finally exhausted and almost destroyed the fragile woman. When Cynthia finally got back on her feet in early March, she found out that she got unemployed. "What will happen now?" she asked Mr. MacPhail. "Nothing. The main thing is that you've beaten the illness, because I was afraid I wouldn't be able to pull you through. We'll find you another job. After all that's happened, there's nothing left to be afraid of." Mr. MacPhail was right. Luck smiled on Cynthia when she least expected it. One of Mr. MacPhail's acquaintances, whom he had contacted since autumn, finally gave him an address. The employer is a wealthy man. He got married a year ago, but his wife has already fired 4 housekeepers. Now she is in Europe, curing her infertility, but she will return in 2 months. I wouldn't like to suggest this job to you, Mr. MacPhail, because the owner's wife will eat your relative and won't choke on her. But Nathan is a generous and good man. Maybe, while his wife is away, your relative can work for him. Mr. MacPhail informed everyone that Cynthia was his relative, and only honouring him did she get the job. The elderly man didn't hide the fact that she had been to prison, but he swore that it was a false accusation. During Cynthia's stay with him, the old man got to know her well. Elated with good news, Cynthia rushed to an interview with her potential employer on the same day, promising herself that she would do everything to make the most demanding employer satisfied with her work. However, her interview, if it could even be called that, dragged on for a long time. Nathan, after hearing the girl's story and feeling a kindred spirit with her, told her about himself. Cynthia learned that he had also been framed many times, but he rose again and achieved success. That's why he didn't get married for a long time, as he often started over. Only on becoming successful and feeling that he was standing firmly on his feet did he decide to start a family. He was 35 years old and dreamed of a beloved wife and children. He met Grace, who was also over 30, and justly decided that she was now ready to become a mother and a good wife. However, a year passed and Grace couldn't get pregnant. She was nervous, took her anger out on the innocent housekeepers, each time finding an excuse for her husband to fire them. Eventually, Cynthia got this job. 2 months in the role of housekeeper passed unnoticed. Nathan worked a lot, Cynthia had plenty of household chores, and everything in the house was sparkling and fresh by the time the owner's wife returned. Cynthia was setting the table for the holiday when Nathan went to the airport to pick up his wife. She was a little anxious about how her relationship with the owner's wife would turn out. Cynthia also had to deal with her feelings for Nathan, which she couldn't admit to herself. From their first meeting, there was something more between them, mutual respect, deep sympathy and understanding. Cynthia liked this man, and she scolded herself for falling in love with him like a naive girl. But he was married, and would never be her husband. It was very difficult to keep her love a secret. When the car arrived, Cynthia's heart was beating wildly. Who was Nathan's chosen one? And then they met. Grace had already prepared herself to drive away the new servant from the threshold and give her husband a hard time for arranging who knows what while she was undergoing unimaginable suffering in the clinic. Cynthia was determined to resist as much as possible, but they were both unprepared for such a meeting, although they recognized each other right away. How could Cynthia not recognize the one because of whom she became fragile? Unsettled life had been shattered. And how could Grace not recognize the girl she set up, coming clean and dry out of the muddy waters she herself had muddied? "Oh, we have a new housekeeper. Wonderful, dear. You can go home now. I'm terribly tired. Come back tomorrow, please, and I'll look at everything here in the morning and decide what to do next." Grace was a magnificent actress. She didn't even flinch, as if she had never seen Cynthia before. Cynthia, on the other hand, left the house in tears and went to Mr. MacPhail's. The old man was already busy on her plot, but seeing the girl, he dropped everything and went to meet her. After listening to her, he himself got confused. "But wait, don't be sad," he said after some thought. "Maybe she didn't recognize you at all." However, Grace did recognize her. She was afraid that Cynthia might tell her husband about it. It became increasingly difficult for her to deceive Nathan, telling him about her attempts to have a child for him. 6 months ago, she started an affair with her fitness trainer, and it was with him that she travelled around Europe. Not a day could pass without Grace seeking a moment with her passionate young macho. Nathan was too old, decent, and old-fashioned for her. She lived with him for money, and her husband didn't even suspect that his wife was taking special pills so as not to get pregnant. The next day, when Cynthia came to work, she was already mentally prepared to be fired. Nathan was at work, and no one could interfere with the conversation with Grace. But to her surprise, Grace understood perfectly the dire situation the girl found herself in, and she offered her a deal. Cynthia would stay to work in her house. Moreover, Grace would tell her husband that she was satisfied with her and considered it necessary to give her an increase. And Cynthia would not tell anyone what she knew about Grace and what role she played in her life. Besides, Cynthia could turn a blind eye to everything that would happen in the house in the future. There was no way out, and Cynthia agreed with all conditions. She needed to restore her old house at all costs. But Grace's words about turning a blind eye to what was happening alarmed Cynthia. She was literally afraid of Nathan, and soon Cynthia realized what was going on. Grace usually disappeared somewhere all day long. Every time when Nathan went on a business trip, Grace sent Cynthia away for half a day, and she had to wander around the city without anything to do. And after returning, she often noticed that in her absence, a stranger had been in the house. She kept quiet, although she felt sorry for Nathan. But one day, what had to happen eventually happened. Nathan flew out on business negotiations abroad. The hostess sent Cynthia for a walk until 4 p.m. on the same day, but the weather worsened after lunch, and the woman became cold. She decided to return home earlier. Cynthia entered the house through the back door and sat down to warm up by the radiator in the utility room, where their gardener, who came twice a week early in the morning, kept his tools. There was no entrance to this room from the house. It was separated from the veranda by only a thin drywall partition. Suddenly, footsteps were heard behind the wall, and then a conversation. Grace was seeing off her young lover. Cynthia's hair stood on end at what she heard. The lovers discussed how to get rid of Nathan. Instantly grabbing her phone, Cynthia turned on the dictaphone, recording, bringing it close to the partition. There was no one in the house, so the lovers spoke loudly and frankly. Besides, they were quarrelling, so they spoke in raised voices. Grace reproached the guy for being slow, spoke about how tired she was of such a life, how she was disgusted by the very thought that she had to, albeit occasionally, sleep with her husband, how she was burning with passion, and she was so young at heart, and Nathan was so boring, and if her lover did not act, she would take matters into her own hands. Cynthia was barely able to hold back her scream, but then the front door slammed shut, and she realized that the lovers had gone out into the backyard. She rushed to the window and managed to snap a few good shots of Grace passionately kissing the man she hung on the neck of. Grace wore a mink short coat over her silk nightgown, and the man's hands were shamelessly groping her under the coat below the back. Cynthia was not going to stay silent any more. Grace's cheating was one thing, and even wanting revenge on her wouldn't make Cynthia tell her husband anything. But the real threat to Nathan was beyond the limit. The next day, Cynthia decided to use another trick. She turned on her dictaphone and put her phone in her pocket before provoking Grace for a frank conversation about their past, pretending that she wanted compensation for the 3 years she spent in prison because of Grace. But Grace just laughed, saying that she was the rich of an influential person and that no one would listen to Cynthia, a beggar. You think they just turned a blind eye to a forged signature back then? I had an affair with a man with big connections. We made a lot of money together. So sit still and be silent, or you will get worse. And if you try to open your mouth, I'll arrange a new term for you, 10 years long. As soon as Nathan arrived, and Grace, barely kissing her husband, rushed off to another beauty procedure, Cynthia decided to speak with him. "I'm very sorry," she said, "but I need to show you something." She showed Nathan the photos and let him listen to her conversation with Grace, and then the conversation between his wife and her lover. The same day, everything was over for Grace. During the investigation, Nathan's lawyers raised Cynthia's case, and the handwriting expertise showed that her signatures on the document were forged. As a result, Grace received a solid sentence and a divorce from Nathan. It was not easy for him to go through all of this, and without Cynthia, it is unknown how it would have ended for him. But Cynthia was there. 6 months later they married. Mr. MacPhail was the father of the bride at the wedding. Yielding to the inconsistent requests of his named daughter, he soon moved in with the young couple in their big house. "It will soon be difficult for me to come to you, Mr. MacPhail," Cynthia explained. "We are expecting a baby with Nathan. And then the child must have a grandfather. The boys can't do without him. Who will teach him everything?" "Oh, you're a sly one." The elderly man wept with joy. "So you're waiting for a boy. But then it should be like this. The boy must be able to work with his hands because all these millions of yours are unreliable. Today you have them, tomorrow you don't, and a man's craft will always provide for him. Therefore, we'll go to the village with the boy in the summer. There's fresh air, a river, and your house needs to be finished." That was the deal, and every summer they spent in the countryside in the fresh air.